Yeah, I wanted to just reminisce a bit, if I could, about my homecoming, because everybody who served in Vietnam had a different experience in terms of homecoming. I came home during that period which was called in confrontation in Indonesia, which precluded Australian military aircraft from flying over Indonesian airspace. So I and others at that particular time flew home in an RAAF Hercules aircraft that actually came from Australia to do a resupply mission. So we flew from Vung Tau base up to Ton Son Nhut Air Base and waited for the Hercules aircraft to arrive, watched it unload and then reload, and then we left Ton Son Nhut sometime later in the afternoon, and our first stop was the RAAF base at Butterworth in Malaya, which is about an hour and a half flight away. And that was surreal because the chap I was with, he was a warrant officer, so we were entitled to stay in the RAF Sergeant's Mess. And we walked into this Sergeant's Mess with the oak wall panels and carpets and stewards and all sorts of things, and thought, this morning we were in our tent and now we're in this palatial surrounding, which was absolutely surreal. And the people who were in the mess weren't the least bit interested in who we were. I think they were just so wrapped up in their own requirements. The next morning, there was a busload of British Army officers waiting to board the plane because they were coming to Australia for a major military exercise. I should have also mentioned the plane was full of mail and sadly 2 coffins that were being repatriated back to Australia. So our next stop from Butterworth was actually in the Cocos Islands in the Indian Ocean, where the plane refuelled. And then the next stop after that was the RAAF base in Perth. It was called RAF Pearce, and we stayed the night there. So this was 2 days of travelling. And then we left very early in the morning, and our next stop was the RAAF base in Richmond in New South Wales. So we've been travelling for some 2.5 days from Ton Son Nhut to RAF Richmond. It was a Friday afternoon. I can remember this quite clearly. There was a bus pulled up outside the plane for the British Army officers. There was a truck pulled up for the 2 coffins, and we had to walk from wherever the plane landed to the movement control office, and we asked the RAF orderly could we use the telephone because we wanted to ring the Army Personnel Depot at South Head in Sydney and ask for transport to pick us up and take us there for the night. And I remember this quite clearly. We picked up the phone and said, look, we've just arrived off a RAF Herc from Vietnam. There's 5 of us. Could you organise some transport, please, to come and pick us up and take us back to South Head Personnel Depot tonight? And there was a silence, and his voice said, it's 4 o'clock Friday afternoon, you've got to be kidding, and click, and that was it. So that was the Australian Army in action for us. So my mate from Vietnam, he and I actually hitchhiked from RAF Richmond to Parramatta. Wasn't any trouble because we were in uniform, we had our kit bags, we hitchhiked. And he was from New South Wales, so he left from Parramatta and went home. And I was there by myself, so I thought, well, the only place in Sydney I know is King's Cross, so I can find a hotel to stay the night there. So I got a cab and said, take me to a cheap hotel in King's Cross. I haven't got a lot of money, I want to stay the night there. So I stayed the night in a hotel, and then organised an air flight the following morning through one of the civilian aircraft, and then flew back to Melbourne. So that was my homecoming. And it was interesting getting back into the army system because not a lot of people in the army had returned from Vietnam at that particular stage, so it was still a bit of a novelty. But there was no one that you could share your experience with because no one had that particular type of experience. So coming back into the army was a more than interesting time, you know. And then sometime later I got out of the army, and that's when I learned to keep my head down because the Vietnam War wasn't popular. and I was told several times that I would probably regret the fact that I'd been to Vietnam and probably wouldn't want to talk about it. And that was the case, like with a lot of people, for a long time, you know. And it was only later in life that I joined the Vietnam Veterans Association, re-emerged in the RSL and all those sorts of things. But that hiatus was for a long time, mainly because of the various incidents which occurred starting from when I arrived at RAF Richmond in October 1966, right through till when I was a civilian, and being told by some of my work colleagues that I probably didn't need to talk about my experiences in Vietnam. I had two memories of that night. One was the cab driver, and he was just terrific. He pulled up at this hotel, took my kit bag out of the boot, and took me into the reception and said to the people behind the reception, "This kid's just off a plane from Vietnam, you look after him." The second thing is that I didn't have enough money for the airfare to fly to Melbourne the next morning. And fortunately, I had some money on me that belonged to one of my army mates who came home 3 weeks before me, and he'd given me some money to buy him a camera at the PX at Saigon on my way out. And I didn't have time to do it, and I still had the money. And I rang him up. He lived in Newcastle, and I told him that I was back in country, that I wasn't able to get his camera and the reasons why. But I actually needed to borrow the money from him to pay for the airfare to come to Melbourne, and he said that's fine, you know. So when I got to Melbourne and got all my back pay, I obviously repaid the loan, you know. And the third thing that comes to mind now I think about it, when I was on that plane coming to Melbourne, I was in uniform, and I had a brooch on with my name on it, with the words Úc Dalai, which means Australian and Vietnamese. And one of the young flight attendants came along and knelt down, and she said, "You were just home from Vietnam." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, my boyfriend's got the same sort of brooch as that. That's how I knew. I took my discharge from the Army in January 1968 after I'd finished 12 years. I was 27 years of age, and I decided that at that particular time I was young enough to start another successful career as a civilian. Had I stayed or re-enlisted in the Army, I would have then become a career person, and I'm not too sure what the prospects would have been. And it probably would have involved a second tour of Vietnam, which is something that I wasn't all that comfortable about. I decided very early in the piece that if I was going to have a civilian career, I needed to become qualified as a civilian. And so I embarked upon studies where I was finished up becoming an automotive mechanical engineer. And also I was admitted to associate membership of the Australian Institute of Management because of the Army qualifications I had. So when I made myself available for employment, I was readily employed. In fact, I had several job offers, and the one I took was with International Harvester, who at that stage had a major truck plant at Dandenong. It's subsequently been taken over by an Italian truck manufacturer. And when I went there to be interviewed, I was actually interviewed for two jobs. One was as an industrial engineer, and one was as a production planner. And it was quite ironical because I was interviewed by both managers, and when I'd finished, I watched these two managers walk into the personnel manager's office, and one of them tossed a coin up in the air, and they had a discussion, came back, and the production planning manager says, well, you're with me because I won. And they'd actually tossed a coin to see which department I was going to work in. So I started work as a production planner, mainly because of my experience as an automotive mechanical engineer in the Army, and they actually had huge Army contracts at that stage. So they saw some benefit in me being ex-Army, working for them on Army contracts. And the production planner's role is to take all the engineering specifications and break those down into assembly modes to assist with the build of the truck in the assembly line, and then teach the production people how to build the prototypes and so on and so forth. So that was what my role was for 9 months. And then I was called away to do my emergency reserve training, and when I came back from that, I was called into the works manager's office, and he said to me quite bluntly, he said, when you were interviewed here, you never told us that you were a warrant officer in the Army. And I said, well, no, I was more interested in my technical qualifications. I said, because I didn't think I could get a job saying I was a warrant officer in charge of a tank repair workshop, you know. And he said, well, we're not going to waste you in the production planning department. We always need people with good supervisory skills. You're going down in the plant to become a foreman, you know. So I spent the remaining time in 3 different departments in the factory as a managerial foreman. I learnt then that International Harvester wasn't the sort of organisation that promoted from within. If they ever wanted a more senior role, they actually recruited from outside. So I decided that after 5 years, I probably had all the experience I wanted in that place, and I then became the operations manager of a company that made battery electric forklifts. So I was the Victorian operations manager in charge of production and sales administration, as well as the service department. After another 5 years, I left there because the company had 2 plants, the one in Melbourne I was responsible for and one in Sydney, and they were going through an economic downturn, so they decided they'd shut the Melbourne plant and consolidate their manufacturing, and virtually the role I had was a bit of a shell, so I left. And at that stage, it was in 1977, Nissan Motor Manufacturing Company had bought the Volkswagen assembly plant in Clayton at Melbourne, and they were looking for managers with automotive experience. So I applied for a position there, and I was appointed as the materials handling manager because of my experience both at International Harvester and as a forklift manufacturer. And I had a stellar career there because I started as a junior manager, and within a decade I was the plant manager. And in my role as a plant manager, we were producing 240 motor cars a day, which probably doesn't sound very many compared to other vehicles, but we're producing a motor car every 100 seconds. I had a responsibility for 1,100 employees, 17 managers, as well as having to deal with 27 shop stewards from 8 different unions. You know, so it was a complex position, and I came out of that having been the supply manager, and before that I was the production control manager. So I'd had a fair understanding of plant operations. And I was in that role for a short period of time, and then I was asked to take on a role that was a bit of a challenge because the company was hemorrhaging money. It was losing money significantly, and it had a $2 billion turnover and was losing millions, and I was asked to head up a small group of people to look at making the company profitable again. Anyway, that led to my leaving the organisation, and I then took on a less stressful role as a middle manager for a company that was making automotive equipment as an induction heating specialist as well as a resistance welding specialist, and I was their manufacturing manager. So that was interesting because all of a sudden I was part of the supply chain, and it was quite interesting dealing with automotive industry executives when you're a supplier, and I never realised how arrogant automotive people were until I took on that particular role. But the role at Nissan was interesting. During my decade or 11 years there, I travelled significantly, Sydney, Adelaide, overseas. I attended lots of functions in Canberra representing the organisation at the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries, or the Federal Automotive Parts Manufacturers. At one stage I headed up a task force representing the automotive industry that looked at their problems related to the waterfront, particularly the Melbourne waterfront, because the industrial issues there were causing significant problems to the local manufacturers. And at that stage, the automotive industry in Melbourne was by far the largest customer for the Port of Melbourne. But we were being penalised by having to significantly increase the amount of inventory that we were carrying in the plants because of the uncertainty of operations on the Melbourne wharf, And so I headed up a group of people that looked at that, so that we could reduce the degree of inventory that we were carrying, and obviously start to save money by not having to pay interest on the investment with the excess inventory we were carrying. So I had a more than interesting role at that particular time, because I learned how to get along with people, and I mean, there was sometimes you needed to have that authoritarian type attitude. The other ones, it had to be that enabling type attitude. But I didn't have any difficulty getting things done. I had particularly when I was the plant manager, I developed a lot of respect within the organisation. Just to give you a little anecdote about that, when I took on the role of being plant manager, I wanted to understand what it was like to be a plant operator. So I actually, on the first day after I was appointed, got issued with a pair of overalls and worked in the body shop as a welder for the whole day, spot welding, alongside the people who were doing other spot welding operations on an assembly line, and had my lunch with them and had my toilet breaks with them and all those sorts of things. For the second day, with the same pair of overalls, I went into the paint shop and lay flat on my back for 8 hours doing body sealing. And it wasn't to develop any kudos, was to understand what it was like to be a production operator. And later, whenever we were making some modifications to the plant for a variety of reasons, I could sit down with the production engineering people and say to them, this is what it's like, this is what you need to fix, this is why we're getting injuries here, this is why we've got some absenteeism because of a whole range of things, because I've had that particular experience. And it endeared me to the people on the shop floor. And the other thing that I learned significantly was that previously, as part of my management training, there was a management technique called searching for excellence. And one of the things that they taught was management by walking around, MBWA, And in this particular concept, it said that you should spend 40% of your time as a manager being with your people. And so my maximum was that I used to spend 40% of my time on the shop floor with the people. And there's nothing more confidential than a noisy motor car plant. And if somebody wanted to talk to me, all they had to do was step out of the assembly line onto the aisle where I was and talk to me about what was happening. They would never come and see me in the office because that was too far away and that was a bit threatening, but I was in their territory. And no one would know what we were talking about because the noise was absorbing the conversation. And I learned a lot at that particular time. And I could go back to my managers and say, do you know about so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so? And invariably they didn't. And I used to become annoyed as to where I was getting his information from, whether it was MBWA was there. And everybody in the plant knew who I was. And it was easy to get things done in times of stress because I had that respect with the people. So when we had to do things like increase the production output or work longer hours, it was easy to negotiate because everybody knew that I was pretty straight and pretty fair income. When I took on the role as a manufacturing manager, which was a middle management position, it was obviously had a lot less stress associated with it, and I wasn't working 7 days a week. And I was already a member of the Uniting Church where I lived at that particular time. I was an elder in the church already, and I was able to devote more of my time to the life of the church. And within a short period of time, I was elected to a senior regional lay leadership position, you know. So I had my paid employment, and then I had this other role. And I had to go to a conference, a church conference, and one of the issues up for discussion was the limited number of people who were seeking ordination within the Uniting Church. So there was always a shortage of ministers, and that was affecting various parishes. And I decided that I could become part of the solution. And about that particular time, I believed that I was being called by God to enter the ordained ministry. So I went through a rigorous process for 12 months where the concept of the call was being really, really tested. And there was various selection processes I had to go through. And I thought that one of the penalties was because I was already age 50 at that particular time. But the church was actually looking for mature age students, people that had a real life experience, and I'd had that particular experience, particularly with people. So the selection conference in 1991 unanimously decided that I was an ideal person to become a candidate. So in January 1992 I left secular employment and started theological studies at Melbourne University for 3 years. So I was doing 2 series of studies concurrently, studies for ordination and studies to complete a Bachelor of Theology degree, you know. And that was interesting because I was going back to, I'd left school at age 15 and a half and here I was back again, you know. So after 3 years of study, which interestingly included 3 months at Peter MacCallum Cancer Institute as an intern chaplain, doing what was called clinical pastoral education, and that helped me to get a better understanding of people in those particular circumstances. It also, interestingly enough, and these are the words of the people who were running the clinical pastoral education course, it took me from being a head person, an engineering manager type person, to being what they called a heart person, someone who could empathise with people in those circumstances, and it certainly had that profound effect upon me, you know. And it helped me later when I was in parish ministry in terms of being able to relate to people who were going through cancer treatment, because I'd spent 3 months at Peter MacCallum in that particular role. So I was ordained at the end of 1994, and I was then appointed to Ballarat. I had a parish with 2 congregations in Ballarat, and I had that role for 11 years, and then I went on to doing locum work around Victoria in various parishes, relieving ministers who were on holidays or when there was no minister available type thing. And then because of my military background, I then had in my parish ministry adopted a role as a chaplain within the ex-service community. So I became the chaplain for the Vietnam Veterans Association here in Ballarat and participated in their annual services. And then I was then asked to become the chaplain in various other organisations, you know, the Ex-Prisoners of War and Relatives Association, and I run a memorial service for that group. in Melbourne, where we have a memorial service for those POWs or widows who have died in an intervening period. I also participate as a chaplain at various ceremonies at the Shrine of Remembrance and for the State RSL and its annual Remembrance Day ceremony as well as called to minister to people in the ex-service community, in the particularly Vietnam veterans. I've spent a lot of time with some Vietnam veterans in their last hours and then had the privilege of conducting their funerals and other things like that.